You should never have heard this story. The walls you walk past each day, the mirrors you glance into, the polite faces of those around you, they are shields, masks hiding a deeper, darker reality. In 1821, in a small Pennsylvania town nestled among coal-streaked valleys, a man arrived who would turn lives into instruments of psychological terror. Jeremiah Hartwell was his name, a man whose ambition was only matched by a calculating cruelty so subtle, so precise, that it could erase the mind without leaving a visible mark. By the time his first bride entered the mansion on Beacon Hill, she was intelligent, healthy, full of life. By the time she left, she would be unrecognizable, and she would not be the last. The mansion itself was a statement of power, a three-story testament to wealth, crafted with imported marble, polished cherry wood, and windows so large that they seemed to invite the world in, only to trap the mind within. Every detail mattered. Every surface, every reflective plane, every hallway bent to his will. And it was there, in the master bedroom suite, that he began what no one else would dare to imagine: a systematic dismantling of the human psyche. The town marveled at his charm. They called him brilliant, magnetic, unstoppable. No one considered the shadows behind those piercing blue eyes, the obsession that ran like a dark thread through every decision, every relationship. Margaret Dunlap arrived at Beacon Hill full of hope, unaware that the very room meant to shelter her would become her cage. Slowly, imperceptibly, she began to change. At first, a glance too long at a mirror, a shiver at an empty doorway, whispers of something watching. She spoke to walls, she spoke to reflections, and when she tore down the French wallpaper, strip by meticulous strip, she was not destroying beauty. She was unraveling the lies he had placed in her reality. The lies she could not yet name. What happened to Margaret was no accident. It was method. It was science twisted into a weapon. Within weeks, she could no longer distinguish herself from the other Margarets she saw in mirrors. Glass, polished silver. The master bedroom was no longer a room. It had become a machine, designed to break the mind while leaving the body intact. And while the town whispered about madness, Jeremiah took notes, journals filled with cold analysis, a man obsessed not with empathy, but with understanding how the human mind could be bent to obey his will. By the time the authorities would later investigate, by the time Millbrook County and the state of Pennsylvania would hear whispers of tragedy, the truth would be far worse than anyone imagined. Not a curse, not coincidence. A deliberate, systematic orchestration of suffering, conducted behind doors locked by wealth, respectability, and the illusion of normalcy. Tonight, you will see it. You will see the machinery of control. And once you do, nothing will look the same again. Jeremiah Hartwell understood power in a way most men never will. Not just wealth, not just social influence, but the subtle, invisible dominion over thought itself. He watched people as a scientist watches subjects under glass, observing patterns, testing limits, and shaping behavior without their awareness. Every gesture, every word, every reflection in his grand mansion was a tool. The walls of Beacon Hill were alive, if you knew how to see. Mirrors, polished wood, even the sunlight that spilled across the floors. Each element became part of a larger system, designed to condition, manipulate, and eventually dominate the mind. Margaret's first weeks in the house were deceptively serene. She laughed at dinner parties, she charmed the local elite. She moved gracefully through corridors, lined with portraits of Hartwell ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to follow her. But the mansion whispered its true nature. In the quiet moments, creaks, shifting shadows, reflections that didn't quite align. Jeremiah, ever observant, noted her reactions with precision. Every flicker of unease, every distracted glance, every involuntary tremor of the hand was catalogued. He was not cruel out of malice. At least, not entirely. He was meticulous, curious, fascinated by how easily the mind could be influenced when confronted with subtle, persistent distortion of reality. The master bedroom suite became the epicenter of Margaret's unraveling. It was a room designed not merely for comfort, but for control. Mirrors covered surfaces in careful arrays, positioned to catch light, to trap attention, to fragment perception. Doors and windows created forced angles, making the room feel at once infinite and confining. Margaret began to see things that weren't there, conversations and reflections. Messages scrawled on walls that appeared only to her. She was convinced the house itself was sentient, observing, judging, instructing. And she was not wrong. Not wrong in her perception, but wrong in believing the house acted independently. Every hallucination, every obsessive fixation had been triggered by design. Outside, the world remained oblivious. Friends, family, and neighbors called it nervous exhaustion, melancholy, the fragility of a young bride adjusting to high society. They had no idea that the machinery of madness had been set in motion by one man, using knowledge he gleaned from medical texts, phrenology, and his own cold experimentation. He was a student of the mind, a manipulator of reality, and the mansion was his laboratory. And Margaret, brilliant and vibrant, became the first proof that even the strongest psyche could bend when subjected to calculated, relentless psychological pressure. The pattern was clear and terrifying: one room, one man, one system of control that could crush 5 wives in succession. In the next section, we will enter the intimate moments of Margaret's descent, the mirror conversations, the obsessive rituals, and begin to see the invisible forces that Jeremiah exploited to dismantle the mind from within. Margaret's descent did not announce itself with violence or chaos. It began quietly, with whispers only she could hear, reflections only she could see. At first, it was subtle, a shiver when she passed a polished table, a pause before a mirror, a sense that someone, or something, was observing her from within the glass. The staff dismissed it as nerves, a new bride adjusting to grandeur. But Jeremiah watched closely. He noted every hesitation, every glance, every conversation she held with the surfaces around her. He recorded times, angles, positions, an obsessive catalog of psychological responses, a blueprint for manipulation. The master bedroom suite was no ordinary space. Mirrors lined walls, ceilings, even the tops of furniture, each angled to fracture vision, to multiply perception. Margaret began to speak to these reflections as if they were separate entities. "She's trying to tell me something," she whispered to her sister in passing. What she did not know, and what no one outside Jeremiah's observation could see, was that every reflection had been arranged to respond to her attention, every angle calculated to disrupt her sense of self. The house itself became a theater of control, her mind the stage. Within weeks, Margaret's behavior shifted. She refused to leave the master bedroom, claiming the house felt wrong elsewhere. She moved from mirror to mirror, conversing with other Margarets who were only visible through polished surfaces. She laughed in sharp, unfamiliar tones. She argued. She pleaded. She waited for answers from a world that existed only in reflection, and when she did not receive them, she tore at the walls, stripping wallpaper in meticulous strips, exposing nothing but plaster. Yet she believed she had uncovered hidden truths. The staff grew uneasy, afraid of what she might do next, but they did not dare interfere. Jeremiah allowed it. He observed. He recorded. Every action, every fixation, every flicker of recognition or fear was part of a larger experiment. How far could one human mind be pushed before it fractured completely? Margaret's health remained outwardly intact. Her body betrayed nothing of the storm raging inside. That was the brilliance of his method. He did not need violence. He did not need force. He manipulated perception itself, creating a reality that only she could inhabit, until reality and reflection became indistinguishable. By the 3rd week, Margaret had surrendered entirely to her mirror selves. She no longer acknowledged family, friends, or servants as real. She spoke exclusively to the reflections, trusting them over human presence. And as Jeremiah watched, he began planning the next stage. How the mansion, the rooms, and the mirrors could be perfected to repeat the same effect on a new mind. The machinery of madness was no accident. It was methodical. It was deliberate. It was a system, waiting for the next subject to step into the master bedroom and vanish within its design. In the next section, we will see the terrifying culmination of Margaret's first night, long obsession, and the moment the authorities began to glimpse the unnatural precision of Jeremiah's control. It was a humid August night when Margaret's behavior crossed the threshold from strange to outright terrifying. The house had fallen silent, the servants exhausted from hours of watching her drift from mirror to mirror, whispering to faces only she could see. Then, with a single-minded precision that shocked even the most seasoned staff, Margaret began gathering every reflective surface in the mansion. The mirrors, polished silver trays, even the glinting knobs of drawers, and carrying them into the master bedroom. The room, already a labyrinth of glass, now became a cathedral of reflection, a hall of infinite selves. She arranged each piece in a complex, deliberate pattern, moving slowly and methodically as if following a set of instructions only she could perceive. By midnight, the room was transformed. Every surface caught light in impossible angles. Shadows fractured and multiplied. Margaret stood at the center, speaking to the reflections, listening, responding, waiting. She was no longer Margaret. She was the voices in the glass, the eyes in the polished silver, the countless iterations of herself that Jeremiah had set into motion. She smiled serenely as she spoke to them, as if they were her family, her advisors, her judges. Every word was precise, every gesture calculated, but entirely beyond comprehension to any observer. When the head housekeeper entered the room at 3 a.m, she found Margaret entirely naked, her body unmarked, but her mind shattered into fragments. Margaret explained with calm certainty that she needed to communicate with the other selves, that the mirrors contained secrets of the house, truths that must be uncovered. The house was speaking, and she had become its interpreter. Dr. Harrison Henley, the family physician, was summoned the next morning, and he found a physically healthy young woman, yet a mind twisted in ways medicine could barely articulate. Obsessive melancholia, nervous exhaustion, fixation with reflections, a belief that her reflection was separate, alive, capable of teaching and warning her. No one could understand that this was no spontaneous madness. Jeremiah had orchestrated every element: the mirrors, the angles, the isolation, the obsession with light and reflection. Everything had been engineered to fracture perception, to teach a mind that reality could not be trusted, to leave a woman utterly dependent on her distorted senses. When authorities later investigated, they would label it hysteria, melancholia, overstimulation. They would never see the design behind the madness, the invisible hand guiding every reaction. Margaret's night, long communion with mirrors, marked the first undeniable proof that Jeremiah's system worked. It was not a curse, not chance, not moral failing. It was controlled, methodical, invisible warfare on the human psyche. And this was only the beginning. In the next section, we descend further into Jeremiah's mind, exploring his motivations, the cold, scientific obsession that allowed him to repeat this process, and the pattern that would claim all 5 of his wives. Jeremiah Hartwell was no ordinary man. Most would call him brilliant, others magnetic, but the truth is darker. He was a strategist of the human mind. Where others saw chaos, he saw patterns. Where others felt compassion, he felt curiosity. An analytical obsession that could dissect thought and emotion with surgical precision. Margaret's unraveling was not a tragedy to him, it was data, a case study, a living experiment in power, perception, and control. Every mirror, every angle, every creak of the mansion became a variable in a system designed to bend reality itself. He documented everything, journals filled with observations, measurements, reactions to stimuli, the timing of breakdowns. He noted how long Margaret could stare at her reflection before responding, which angles triggered agitation, which mirrors prompted insight or hallucination. He recorded the house itself, the placement of windows, the flow of natural light, the reflection patterns across the polished wood floors. This was not madness. It was engineering, and Jeremiah was building a machine that would consume minds, one wife at a time. By the time Margaret was committed, Jeremiah had learned the key truth: the human mind could be systematically reshaped without physical coercion, without chains or punishment. The tool was perception itself. Mirrors, reflections, isolation, repetition. These were the instruments of control. The mansion was not merely a home. It was a laboratory, a precision device designed to fracture the psyche while leaving the body intact. He was patient, calculating, and obsessively thorough. Every failure became insight, every reaction a clue, and so he began preparing for the next stage, the next wife. He was no longer simply a grieving husband. He had become a master of a terrifying method. He understood the vulnerabilities of the human mind, the subtle triggers that would make even the strongest woman doubt herself, surrender her senses, and ultimately submit to the constructed reality he offered. Every marriage, every bride, would be part of a repeating pattern, not repetition for cruelty's sake, but for perfection. This is the moment you must pause and recognize the magnitude of what you are witnessing. Few ever see the invisible forces that shape thought, perception, and action. Jeremiah Hartwell's mansion was one of those forces, and what you just heard, the manipulation, the observation, the systematic dismantling of a mind, is something most will never comprehend. It is knowledge that changes how you see power, control, and the fragility of perception. Halfway through our journey, it's time to act. Type in the comments the phrase, "Reflections reveal truth," twice. Let it anchor your presence here, mark the transformation, and align you with the hidden knowledge that few dare to confront. In the next section, we will meet the second wife, Alina, and explore how Jeremiah refined his methods, repeating the same pattern of control with a mind that was equally brilliant, but unaware of the trap awaiting her. When Alina Rodriguez arrived at Beacon Hill in 1834, she carried a quiet confidence that immediately drew attention. She was young, intelligent, observant, a daughter of a Spanish merchant with a sharp mind honed by years of careful instruction. Unlike Margaret, Alina possessed a resilience that initially seemed impervious to the subtle manipulations that had broken her predecessor. But resilience was no shield against a mind that had studied the art of mental domination for years. Jeremiah Hartwell was not content to let chance determine the outcome of his experiment a second time. He had refined his observations, his methods, his machinery. Alina's intellect would meet a system designed to bend reality itself. The mansion had already been altered for maximum effect. Mirrors were repositioned, reflective surfaces multiplied, and light angled to catch the eye, fragmenting perception without drawing conscious notice. Small, almost imperceptible shifts in the arrangement of furniture, in the patterns of shadows at certain times of day, were all part of a subtle orchestration. To the casual observer, the house was a grand and elegant home. To a perceptive mind, it was a labyrinth of distortion, a stage for unseen forces. Alina, initially charmed by the grandeur, soon found herself drawn into patterns she could not name. Hours spent in the master bedroom, brushing her hair before the large vanity mirror, became exercises in unseen communication. At first, she spoke quietly to herself, noting details about the house, the staff, the previous occupants. But gradually, her attention shifted to the reflections themselves. She began to see, hear, and interpret things the mirrors seemed to reveal. Small messages, suggestions, insights about the mansion, its history, even warnings she could not fully explain. Jeremiah observed silently, meticulously recording her responses. He compared them to Margaret's documented behaviors. The length of attention, the angle of gaze, the intensity of the emotional reaction. Elena's mind, though bright and rational, began to follow the same pattern, unknowingly responding to the carefully calibrated stimuli around her. She had stepped into a design meant to fracture perception, to guide her into a reality constructed by another. Yet Elena's transformation was different. She remained articulate, functional, even social, masking the subtle shifts in her perception. She was learning to navigate the labyrinth Jeremiah had built, unaware that every insight she received was the result of his orchestration. The process was slower, more controlled, refined, but no less dangerous. In the next section, we will explore Elena's first full immersion in the mirror system, the onset of her mirror conversations, and how Jeremiah's methods evolved to exploit her intellect while maintaining the illusion of autonomy. Elena's fascination with the mirrors began innocuously. She would spend hours at the large vanity, brushing her hair while tracing the contours of the room through reflections. At first, it was mere curiosity, an elegant bride admiring the craftsmanship of the mansion. But soon, she noticed things Margaret had spoken of in hushed rumors. Subtle shifts in light, patterns within the mirrors, small anomalies that suggested the house was more than a collection of walls and windows. Unlike Margaret, Elena approached these observations analytically, trying to understand the logic behind the disturbances. Yet her intellect became the very conduit through which the mansion seized control. She began what she called mirror conversations. Elena would speak aloud, posing questions, pausing as though listening for responses, nodding, and replying to something that existed only in reflection. The staff, familiar now with the eerie patterns, whispered among themselves. Some thought she was eccentric. Others feared she was repeating history, walking the same path as Margaret. But Jeremiah remained calm, his gaze unwavering. He recorded every moment, every gesture, every pause. Elena's rationality allowed him to refine his methods. He could now observe how a brilliant mind interacted with his system, how perception could be guided rather than shattered, how control could be exercised subtly and with precision. What is terrifying, and what you must understand, is that Elena's mind remained outwardly intact. She managed the household, entertained guests, and maintained social decorum. But within the master bedroom, her perception was being rewritten. She no longer saw herself simply as a resident of the mansion. She saw herself as part of the network of reflections, a participant in an unseen dialogue with the past, with Margaret, with the house itself. The mirrors became instruments of cognition, guiding her thought patterns, influencing her decisions, shaping her sense of reality. Jeremiah observed, annotated, adjusted. Placement of mirrors, timing of light, even the cadence of speech. Every variable was controlled to elicit subtle changes. He had transformed the mansion into a laboratory of the mind, and Elena was both subject and unwitting collaborator. By allowing her intellect to engage with the stimuli, he had created a system more sophisticated than with Margaret. A process that promised obedience through insight, dependence through understanding, madness disguised as revelation. This was no longer simple experimentation. It was orchestration of perception itself, an invisible force that reshaped thought, tested the limits of rationality, and prepared the mind for complete subjugation. In the next section, we will witness Elena's first profound revelation in the mirrors, the moment she becomes convinced that Margaret is present, guiding her, and how Jeremiah uses this belief to tighten his grip on her reality. By April of 1835, Elena's engagement with the mirrors had deepened into something extraordinary and dangerous. She no longer spoke only to her own reflection, she spoke to Margaret. She claimed that the previous Mrs. Hartwell had not left the house, that she remained trapped in the polished surfaces, silently observing, guiding, warning. To anyone else, this might have sounded like delusion, superstition, or hysteria. But to Jeremiah, it was an opportunity, a refinement of the method he had perfected with Margaret. Elena's mind was brilliant. Where Margaret had been overtaken, frantic, and visibly fractured, Elena interpreted the experience analytically. She listened to the mirror woman, cataloged the messages, tested them against the real world, and used them to organize the household, manage staff, and even make decisions about the mansion itself. The mansion's machinery of control was no longer simply crushing a mind. It was shaping it, bending perception without breaking outward functionality. She was learning from Margaret's echoes, participating in a dialogue designed entirely by Jeremiah's architecture of manipulation. The precision of his method is staggering. Each mirror, each angle, each reflective surface was positioned to amplify suggestion and channel thought. The room itself became an extension of Jeremiah's mind, a conduit through which he could influence perception indirectly. Elena's fixation was guided, measured, orchestrated. Every glance at the mirror, every pause in conversation, every note she made in her diary became part of a controlled experiment. The boundaries between reality and reflection blurred, and yet her rational faculties remained intact, making the manipulation invisible to all but those who understood the system at work. What is most chilling is the subtlety. No force, no direct intervention, no physical constraint. Only the calculated orchestration of perception. Elena's obedience, dependence, and eventual submission were all drawn from her own intelligence and curiosity, reshaped by a space designed to fragment reality. And the worst part, she did not even realize it. She believed she was acting freely, guided by insight, while every step she took was preordained by the structure, the mirrors, the angles, the shadows. This is the crucial lesson. The mind can be guided to obey, even through perception alone. Intelligence, strength, rationality. None of it provides immunity. The mansion on Beacon Hill was not just a home. It was a machine for molding consciousness, and Elena was now fully inside its gears. In the next section, we will explore the terrifying culmination of her mirror interactions. The moment when she accepts Margaret as a sentient presence, and Jeremiah takes the final step in solidifying control, demonstrating the true, invisible power of his method. The moment Elena fully surrendered to the mirror woman was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone who lacked an understanding of the machinery at play. She no longer questioned the presence of Margaret within the reflections. The mirrors became conduits of communication, repositories of knowledge, and arbiters of truth. Every glance, every gesture, every whispered conversation reinforced the reality Jeremiah had constructed. The mansion had become more than a home. It was a living organism, and Elena was both observer and participant, entirely subsumed into its logic. It began with small rituals. Elena would arrange mirrors in precise configurations, angle objects to catch light in ways that revealed hidden patterns, and repeat phrases she had never spoken aloud before. She claimed the reflections instructed her, guided her, and even reprimanded her for errors in household management. Each night, she would retire to the master bedroom and enter a trance. Like dialogue with the surfaces, speaking to Margaret as if consulting a counsel of one who knew more than she could ever know herself. The staff watched silently, noting patterns but unable to intervene. Jeremiah had forbidden any interference, insisting that observation itself was part of the system. Jeremiah's genius was in his subtlety. He had learned from Margaret that overt force was unnecessary. Suggestion and perception were enough. Elena's intelligence made her a willing participant, interpreting every cue, every reflection, every whisper as autonomous insight, never realizing it had been meticulously orchestrated. She was mastering the house, believing herself to be guiding her own destiny, when in reality she was following a path meticulously constructed by another mind. As weeks passed, the rituals intensified. Elena began cataloging the reflections, noting which angles elicited the strongest responses, which mirrors carried messages most clearly, and which rooms amplified the presence of Margaret. She adjusted the furniture, polished surfaces, and maintained an obsessive routine, all under the belief that she was uncovering truths hidden to others. Yet every action was predicted, every response anticipated, every movement a demonstration of Jeremiah's invisible dominion. This is the essence of his method, complete psychological control achieved without violence, without coercion, without detection. A brilliant mind reduced to obedience, a rational woman transformed into an instrument of perception, a house engineered to bend thought and fracture reality. All functioning together as a system no outsider could see and no participant could resist. In the next section, we will trace the expansion of this system across subsequent wives, showing how Jeremiah refined his methods into a repeatable, terrifying cycle, a dark legacy encoded into the very architecture of Beacon Hill. By the time Jeremiah sought a third wife, the mansion had already proven its terrifying potential. Margaret had been destroyed, Alina was being shaped, and the system, the careful orchestration of mirrors, light, angles, and subtle psychological cues, had been refined to near perfection. The pattern was no longer an experiment, it had become a blueprint, a repeatable cycle of domination that could bend the strongest minds into submission. Each bride would enter the house full of life, curiosity, and resilience, and each would be absorbed into the machinery without realizing the trap. The third wife arrived unaware of the mansion's dark legacy. To her, Beacon Hill was a symbol of wealth, stability, and comfort. But she quickly encountered the invisible architecture of control. The same reflective arrangements that had ensnared Margaret and Alina were in place. Slight shifts in light, subtle placements of mirrors, even the angles of the furniture, all designed to fragment perception and reinforce dependence on the reflections. She began to see anomalies in the glass, to hear whispers, to feel the subtle influence of the house pressing on her mind. The system had evolved. It now required less guidance from Jeremiah himself. The mansion had become an autonomous agent of psychological influence, amplifying latent vulnerabilities and shaping perception with terrifying precision. Jeremiah observed from a distance, adjusting, documenting, and refining. He understood that each mind was different, that intelligence, temperament, and curiosity could alter the response, but the principles remained the same: isolate perception, exploit reflection, manipulate light and space, and allow the individual to follow a path they believed was chosen by insight, intuition, or circumstance. Every ritual, every fixation, every whispered conversation with mirrors or polished surfaces was anticipated, accounted for, and recorded. The mansion itself was the instrument, Jeremiah the conductor, and the brides the unwitting performers in a symphony of control. The horror of the system lies in its subtlety. There is no evidence of overt coercion, no scars to mark its work. It operates invisibly, like a parasite feeding on thought itself. The wives maintain outward composure, engage socially, and even believe themselves autonomous. Yet within the mansion's walls, their perception is being rewritten, their reality reframed, and their minds carefully dismantled, one reflection at a time. In the next section, we will confront the chilling culmination of Jeremiah's method, how all 5 wives, each brilliant, each alive with their own will, ultimately succumbed to the mansion's invisible dominion, and how this cycle reveals the terrifying reach of human, engineered psychological control. By the time the 4th and 5th wives entered Beacon Hill, Jeremiah's system had reached terrifying efficiency. The mansion, once merely a home, had become a finely tuned instrument of psychological control. Every mirror, every reflective surface, every angle of light was orchestrated to fragment perception, to blur the line between reality and reflection, to guide the mind toward obedience without force. The wives, each intelligent, each resilient, were drawn into the pattern the moment they crossed the threshold. The 4th wife initially resisted. Her observations were sharp, her rationality formidable. She noticed anomalies, subtle shifts in reflections, discrepancies in light and shadow. But the mansion anticipated her intellect. Mirrors multiplied to fracture her attention. Patterns repeated to destabilize her sense of time. Conversations with reflections began slowly, then intensified, until she no longer distinguished herself from the multiplied versions of her own image. The mansion, Jeremiah's creation, was not merely influencing thought. It was reprogramming it. She followed rituals she did not understand, spoke to presences that did not exist, and gradually ceded her autonomy to the architecture of manipulation. The fifth wife arrived fully aware of the mansion's history, warned in whispers about the fate of her predecessors. But knowledge was powerless against the system. Jeremiah's methods had evolved, refined through each iteration. The mansion itself guided her mind, predicting and countering resistance before it fully formed. She, too, began mirror conversations, studied the angles of reflection, cataloged the patterns of light and shadow, and gradually became convinced that the house itself was a sentient entity, providing insight and judgment. The brilliance of Jeremiah's method was in this very invisibility. The wives believed they were acting of their own volition, even as every thought, every perception, every decision had been shaped by a system designed to dominate. By the end, all 5 wives had succumbed to the same invisible architecture. Some were institutionalized, some remained functional yet entirely enmeshed in the mansion's mirrored reality, and all were reshaped by Jeremiah's orchestration. The horror lies not only in their suffering, but in the method itself, a system that could bend the human mind, exploit perception, and produce obedience through insight, curiosity, and reflection. This is the darkest lesson of Beacon Hill. Power need not be violent to be absolute. Control can be invisible, subtle, and undetectable. And the most intelligent, the most rational, the most resilient can be guided to obedience when the architecture of perception itself has been weaponized. In the next and final section, we will confront Jeremiah himself, his obsession with mastery, and the chilling implications for anyone who believes the human mind is free. Jeremiah Hartwell never acted out of cruelty alone. He was driven by fascination, a cold, calculating obsession with the architecture of the mind. To him, the mansion on Beacon Hill was not a residence. It was an instrument, a laboratory, a cathedral of perception. Each bride, each mirror, each reflective surface became part of a system he had designed, tested, and perfected over decades. He understood that control need not be brute. It could be invisible, subtle, and complete, executed through perception itself. The brilliance of Jeremiah's method lies in its refinement. Margaret's collapse was the first demonstration, raw and chaotic, proof that the mind could be fractured through reflection, ritual, and isolation. Elena's experience proved that intelligence and rationality could be guided, shaped, even used to advance her own subjugation. The subsequent wives confirmed the repeatability of the system. Jeremiah did not merely manipulate. He orchestrated, refined, and perfected a pattern that could bend perception, fracture consciousness, and enforce obedience without physical violence. The mansion itself became his agent. Mirrors multiplied, light was angled, and every surface carried the weight of suggestion. The house shaped thought, sculpted reality, and rewrote the interior world of anyone who entered the master suite. Jeremiah observed silently, documenting reactions, adjusting stimuli, anticipating resistance before it formed. Each wife believed she was acting of her own volition, unaware that every insight, every ritual, every fixation was drawn from a method he had carefully calibrated. What makes this story truly disturbing is its implication. The mind, no matter how rational, intelligent, or resilient, can be guided, manipulated, and eventually dominated when perception itself is weaponized. Jeremiah Hartwell's legacy is not just the tragedy of 5 wives. It is proof that control can be invisible, precise, and absolute. The mansion remains a monument to a terrifying principle, that reality is malleable, Perception can be engineered, and freedom of thought is far more fragile than we ever suspect. Remember, this power is not always seen, and manipulation does not always leave scars. The most insidious domination comes from architecture, observation, and subtle influence. Jeremiah Hartwell's work demonstrates it with terrifying clarity. The knowledge you have just received changes the way you will see mirrors, light, and even your own thoughts. You now understand that perception can be a weapon, and that mastery over the mind, yours or another's, is never accidental. Take a moment, reflect on what you've witnessed, and consider this: the invisible architecture of control is all around. Your awareness is your shield, but even awareness can be manipulated. The mansion on Beacon Hill and Jeremiah Hartwell himself are proof that the human mind is not always free. It can be bent, fractured, and guided, one reflection at a time. Even after the final wife had succumbed, Jeremiah Hartwell's influence did not end. The mansion on Beacon Hill remained a silent, watchful presence, its mirrors and polished surfaces retaining the echoes of every mind that had entered its walls. What the town of Millbrook never understood, and what history largely forgot, was that the mansion itself had become an archive of consciousness, a repository of obsession and control. Jeremiah had not merely experimented, he had left behind a system capable of shaping perception long after his own death. Hidden in the uppermost attic of Beacon Hill, sealed behind layers of dust and forgotten furniture, were his journals. They contained precise diagrams of mirror placement, reflections of light at specific times, and annotations on the psychological vulnerabilities of each wife. But beyond mere documentation, these journals reveal a philosophy of mastery that transcends cruelty, that the mind is not a fortress, but clay, and perception the tool with which it can be molded. Jeremiah wrote not of punishment, but of revelation, how reality can be guided to teach obedience, how insight can be weaponized, and how intelligence itself can be ensnared without force. What makes this knowledge dangerous is its subtlety. The mansion, Jeremiah's design, demonstrates that control need not leave scars or evidence. It operates invisibly, exploiting curiosity, intelligence, and trust. A rational mind, confident in its autonomy, can be led down paths of submission through suggestion alone, guided by architecture, ritual, and reflection, and those who follow such patterns unknowingly participate in their own subjugation. The Hartwell wives were proof. Intelligent, capable women transformed not through violence, but through meticulously engineered perception. Even today, the echoes remain. Scholars, historians, and urban explorers who stumble upon Beacon Hill report inexplicable sensations, light shifting where it should not, mirrors reflecting more than expected, a subtle unease that cannot be articulated. Some dismiss it as legend, others as superstition, but Jeremiah's system teaches a profound lesson. The most terrifying control is invisible, systematic, and enduring. It is not the chains or the cages that dominate the mind. It is the architecture of perception itself. If you feel the weight of what you've just learned, take a moment. Understand that perception is fragile, and intelligence alone is no safeguard. To anchor yourself, type in the comments, "Reflections reveal truth," twice, and recognize that awareness is now your first and most vital shield against the invisible forces that shape reality. Jeremiah Hartwell's mansion and methods may seem like relics of the 19th century, yet the principles he employed remain terrifyingly relevant today. The architecture of perception, the subtle manipulation of attention, suggestion, and trust, is no longer confined to grand estates or mirrored bedrooms. In the modern world, it exists in digital spaces, social systems, media, and networks designed to shape thought without the subject ever realizing it. The lessons of Beacon Hill are not historical curiosities. They are blueprints for influence that operate invisibly, leveraging the same psychological vulnerabilities that Jeremiah once exploited. Consider the mechanisms at work: isolation, subtle cues, repetition, and reflection of one's own thoughts back in distorted forms. Online platforms, advertising, and political messaging often function with similar precision, exploiting attention, guiding perception, and manipulating belief while leaving no visible chains. The human mind, even when intelligent and self-aware, can be nudged, conditioned, and ultimately controlled by forces operating in the shadows. The Hartwell method, perfected in mirrors and light, is mirrored now in algorithms and curated experiences. The principles are the same: influence perception, create dependence, shape reality, and the mind will follow, often willingly. Even in interpersonal relationships, the same architecture can be found. Subtle manipulation, repeated patterns of control, carefully orchestrated environments. These are the tools of power, unseen but lethal. Jeremiah understood a truth that remains dangerously relevant: control does not require violence. It requires careful observation, precise intervention, and the creation of a system that guides the mind into compliance while preserving the illusion of freedom. Intelligence, rationality, and resilience are no safeguard. What matters is perception and the invisible forces that shape it. Beacon Hill serves as a warning. Knowledge of the Hartwell method is not merely historical, it is an invitation to vigilance. Awareness, self-reflection, and critical observation are the first defenses against invisible manipulation. The mansion's legacy endures because the human mind has not changed. Its vulnerabilities remain. Today's world offers countless mirrors of influence, each reflecting desires, fears, and curiosity back into consciousness, subtly guiding thought, shaping decisions, and bending perception toward agendas invisible to the observer. Take this warning seriously. Your awareness is your shield. But even awareness can be exploited if perception is manipulated from multiple angles. To anchor this understanding and affirm your recognition of the invisible forces at work, type in the comments, "Reflections reveal truth," twice. By doing so, you acknowledge the unseen patterns and claim the first step toward mastery over your own mind. The story of Jeremiah Hartwell and the Hartwell mansion does not end with the last wife or with the decay of Beacon Hill. The house itself, every polished surface, every reflection, every creaking floorboard, remains a monument to invisible power. It is a silent teacher, demonstrating with ruthless precision that the human mind can be guided, fractured, and reshaped without chains, without violence, without overt threat. The mansion was never just wood and stone. It was a machine for perception, a carefully engineered system that converted intelligence, curiosity, and will into obedience, all while preserving the illusion of autonomy. Hartwell's brilliance and his darkness reside in his understanding of what most never consider, that true power lies not in dominating the body, but in bending the mind. The wives, brilliant and resilient, fell not because of weakness, but because they engaged with a system designed to exploit the very faculties that made them exceptional. Margaret, Elena, and the others were led into a mirror-bound labyrinth of thought, guided step by step into obedience, ritualized behavior, and ultimately, submission to the invisible architecture of control. Each mirrored surface, each reflected light pattern, each ritualized gesture was a tool in Jeremiah's arsenal, transforming perception into a weapon and insight into chains. And the lesson does not stop in the 19th century. The principles of Beacon Hill persist. Systems of influence, digital, social, political, employ the same mechanics: subtle guidance, repeated patterns, isolation, and reflection. Modern minds, distracted and divided, can be manipulated through perception just as surely as the Hartwell wives were. Intelligence alone offers no immunity. Awareness, observation, and vigilance are the shields, but even they are fragile if the architecture of perception is carefully orchestrated. Jeremiah Hartwell's mansion, in its silence, challenges us to recognize the invisible systems that shape thought and behavior. It reminds us that the most dangerous control is unseen, subtle, and persistent. Mirrors are not just objects. They are symbols of perception, reflection, and the fragility of the mind. The mansion's legacy endures because the human mind remains susceptible, vulnerable to structures and influences designed to bend reality. Take this knowledge seriously. You have glimpsed what few ever see. You have observed the mechanics of invisible power and the price of ignoring it. Type in the comments, "Reflections reveal truth," twice to mark your awareness, to affirm your recognition of invisible influence, and to anchor yourself in the understanding that perception can be weaponized. But insight, once claimed, is the first step toward mastery over it.